Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum to the audience. We return with the third session of our course, Principles of Hadith, with our young scholar Shah Zubairi. And it's been a while that we recorded the earlier sessions, but we'll continue from where we left off. So I hand over to you, Shah.
Thank you. So we will be looking at the historical developments of Hadith literature in our lesson today. Now, there are two ways to approach this topic. The first is to approach it by means of the importance different Hadith collections have for our tradition. So, for example, within the Sunni tradition, the Sahih of Imam Bukhari and the Sahih of Imam Muslim are perhaps the most venerated books. It's often said that they are second only to the Quran in terms of their authenticity. One method of studying these developments is through the actual intricacies of these books themselves, what Imam Bukhari did, and then connecting it back to the events that were playing throughout their life, and then connecting that further with the tradition they were a part of, the Ahlul Hadith. The other approach, the one that I've taken, is to go in a chronological fashion. We will be looking at the systematic development of the Hadith books. Now, the practical implications of these Hadith collections are immense. As some novices of the Islamic tradition will know, that we've had a classical divide between the Ahlul Hadith and the Ahlul Rai. The Ahlul Rai primarily relied upon personal opinion and reasoning, whereas the Ahlul Hadith, as the name suggests, relied on Hadith. The condensation of Hadith books from perhaps larger works such as the Musnad of Imam Ahmad to more concise and methodically structured works such as the Jami of Imam Tirmizi or the Sahih of Imam Muslim shows us how the Muslim tradition slowly and gradually gravitated towards a more Hadith-centric approach. It made life a lot easier. So, for example, as a classical scholar, before these books existed, you would have to seek out traditions from a teacher rather than having them in a book. Thus, Al-Amash is reported to have remarked with Abu Hanifa that Abu Hanifa told him that you are the pharmacists and we are the doctors, that you give us the prescriptions by which we issue verdicts. Now, this was a very lengthy process. And over the course of 3 centuries or 4 centuries, the condition became such that a jurist would have perhaps a manuscript of some book. And then we will look at what manuscripts were in vogue in which era and which area had which books. And that's all quite interesting. But one thing we must keep in mind as I'm teaching this, I have not gone into a lot of depth or nuance for the simple reason that early Islamic history is very convoluted. There is the normative opinion, but then each of those has its own nuance. So I've taken the more general readings of our history and the generally accepted details, even if perhaps an Orientalist or some academic disagrees with them, I have adhered to those general normative ideas. Perhaps at a later date, we'll discuss why those nuances exist. But in this lesson, for our purposes, I have not considered those. Now, with that out of the way, Hadith collection began with booklets of the companions. It's reported that companions such as Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As had some booklets. It's narrated that Hazrat Abu Bakr as-Siddiq compiled 2 volumes of hadith that he later either burned or got rid of by drowning them in some river. Therefore, early collections of hadith have existed, but we will bypass the collections of the companions simply because none of those are extant. The earliest extant booklet of hadith that we have can be traced back to Tabi, a student of a companion. That is the Sahifa of Imam Hammam bin Munabbih. He was a student of Abu Huraira. Now, Abu Huraira is a very prolific uh, narrator of hadith. It's said some 7,000 narrations can be traced back to him. And we find that the Sahifa of Imam Munabbih actually preserves a great many of Abu Huraira's narrations. So we never actually found per se a manuscript of it. Dr. Hamidullah did. But what we then found was that when we corroborated what those narrations were with a later book, such as the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, we found that the narrations actually match in terms of their text. So and there's almost a 150-year gap between these two figures, but the text largely remains the same. So from that, Mustafa Azmi has extrapolated that there were primarily two methods of hadith transmission. There was riwayat bil lafz and riwayat bil mana. Hadith scholars typically preferred riwayat bil lafz. From that manuscript of Sahifa Hammam bin Munabbih, we've actually inferred that, since the similarities in text are that serious. Now,
Can I ask here
yes.
that are you saying that the riwayat have primarily been, or not necessarily primarily, but to some degree have been riwayah bil lafz, as in they were transferred or transmitted word to word? Because my understanding was that it was primarily riwayah bil maani, which meant that somebody heard something and then they tried to pass on as much as they remembered or as accurately they remembered. Mostly, what they believe they heard, that's what they try to pass on.
This is actually a very good question, and it carries some detail. What we can say for certainty regarding a lot of the tabain and taba tabain is that they relied on riwayat bil lafz. That's something we can establish. This Sahifa does that. What we cannot establish is whether the companions themselves narrated through riwayat bil lafz. That is something we cannot establish. But the latter part of the chain, we're actually able to trace it. If you take a look at, for example, the Musannaf of Abdul Razak or the Musnad of Tayalisi, you'll find that there is very seldom are there great variations in text. However, that being said, there are two methods of riwayat bil lafz as well. One is that you have a lengthy tradition and you quote the entirety of that tradition. The entirety of a tradition you will often find in some obscure book of hadith. You will not find it in the canonical texts. And you may even find it with weaker chains. Versus you will have narrators, individual narrators, narrating individual parts of that text. Of that one hadith, it will splinter off, and you will find that a different chain, completely different, perhaps in some other region even, the same text is being propelled forward, just though a part of it. But the words of that text will be verbatim.
Right. So what I'm understanding is, let's say 50 years onwards, because for example, as an example or as a case study, you refer to two manuscripts that we see almost 150 years apart, and then we see that there is close textual match between them, right? So let's assume that from 50 years onwards, um, the tabain and then the tabain have been so diligent in preserving the words that they have practically made it riwayah bil lafz afterwards. But what is the judgment of the muhaddithin on the actual text itself, vis-a-vis or with reference to the Prophet himself? Do they believe that this is Ravaya Bilmani from the Prophet? But later on, the preservation became much more strong, much more stringent, and therefore we have been able to preserve those words, Billafs, going forward. But initially, whatever was captured was Bilmana.
Well, the thing is, generalizations can seldom be made in hadith. It's a case by case analysis that the Muhaddithin will offer. So one narration comes to mind where Abu Huraira, this is in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, he narrates something along the lines of, once again, Riwayat Bilmana, that uh, bad luck is found in horses, women, and houses, something to that effect. Now, he captured the Prophet's words as he understood them, as he understood them. Then a student of his, I believe it was Urwa ibn Zubair perhaps, who brought this to Sayyid Aisha. and said, this is what Hazrat Abu Huraira is saying. And then she corrected Abu Huraira and she said, no. On the contrary, the Prophet was saying this is what the people of the Jahiliyyah used to say. So we find incidents like these scattered across our tradition. So from that, we can perhaps make general ideas regarding a specific narration that perhaps in this narration, this is perhaps what happened. But we must also remember that our muhaddithin have typically not paid a lot of attention to the text itself.
Right.
The matan has always largely been secondary.
Despite the fact that you are saying that there is such close preservation, well, such a strong preservation of text, or at least we see some samples where we see that the words have not really changed. Despite that, it was secondary.
It was secondary because our muhaddithin looked at those variations in text in light of the chain. So, for example, they would find that 10 narrators of a hadith have transmitted one variant, but they'll find that one of the 11th narrator has introduced something shaz in it, something strange in it, or something gharib in it. And therefore, you would then have the issue of, okay, did this man invent this himself, or was it a part of the original tradition? Now, often these gharib expressions are the result of riwayat bil mana, because one of the narrators somewhere along that 11th chain has decided to interpret the words of his teacher, and they have become virtually indistinguishable from the prophetic text itself. This used to happen with Imam Zuhri a lot, when, in a few traditions in Sahih Bukhari itself, we have an expression called Balaghat al-Zuhri, additions of Zuhri, which have become almost indistinguishable from the hadith itself. So this happened
Mhm.
naturally, but regarding your initial question of whether we can ascertain um, about the companions, whether they decided to or were able to remember or memorize a text verbatim, I don't think any companion or I don't think it can be said with any real confidence regarding what a companion did.
Right.
Perhaps when we apply principles of textual criticism, that is criticism of the matan, as Khatib al-Baghdadi has pointed out and other authorities have pointed out, when we try to reconcile the text with the Quran or the Sunnah Mutawatira, perhaps then when there is an irreconcilable difference between the two, perhaps then it can be said that the text was transmitted in meaning, interpretation of the companion rather than verbatim words.
Right. So I'll come back to this because I think this is an important point. But I want to go back to something that you said earlier, which is we discussed the point of how the text was being preserved of the riwayah. Initially, it may have been more bilmani, let's say. But you said that as we see time moving forward, as it spreads, the larger ahadith or the larger matan of ahadith, we see less preservation of those, and they become kind of rarer in terms of having been preserved fully, and instead we see fragments or parts of it being preserved more, in a sense that they get passed on more, and it makes a logical it makes logical sense as well, that there's a greater cognitive load of remembering a very long or extended hadith, as opposed to this, parts of it, or sentences from it become much more popular or much more remembered, and then they pass on much further, and are reported by a lot more people, right, in precise text, as opposed to remembering a very long hadith in precise text, passing on each word correctly. So, have you observed that this is a general trend, or is this something that we see, let's say, in a few examples?
No, this is a general trend, simply because ahadith, as I mentioned, were used for a purpose. That quote of Amash that I mentioned. Ahadith had a practical application. Now, if you are familiar with law, you'll find that every ruling requires a basis, an asl. Now, regarding Aqidah, our scholars mentioned how a hadith could not be relied upon to prove an Aqidah, but regarding more practical things such as fiqh, we would rely on those narrations. So it would then be inefficient for a muhaddis to quote a lengthy text simply to extrapolate the fact that wudu is farz. Context was often dropped, and this later does become a problem because we find in certain very important traditions that have been fundamental to Islamic law how when the context is dropped, the meaning is changed almost entirely. For example, regarding the killing of apostates, that's an example of this. The context was completely dropped. Regarding, say, the sighting of the moon, the context was completely dropped. We have found that in uh, one hadith, which is quite popular these days, regarding homosexuality, kill the one who does it and the one to whom it is done, there's no context for that narration. What were the circumstances which compelled the Prophet to say that? We don't know. So it's quite a task deciphering what the point or purpose of a prophetic statement was. And
Hmm.
that impacts how you look at Islamic rulings in general. Are they merely arbitrary, as certain Ahlul Hadith scholars have claimed, or do they have a very real rationale behind them?
Hmm. So, I mean, what it sounds like is that you know, from the motivations of the people who are collecting these works or using them for fiqh purposes, it seems like we could have two different motivations. One could be, let's preserve each and every word of the Prophet that we remember as accurately and as precisely as possible, and then keep copying it forward as accurately and precisely as possible forever. That could be one aim or motivation of gathering hadith or preserving it. And the second could be, what have we gathered from the Prophet that we could use for fiqh or reasoning purposes within religion, whether we are forming an aqidah or we are making a judgment, whatever the purpose may be. And here the words more have a utility, right?
Yeah.
So if we are looking at it based on its utility, then we are more likely to take parts of it which help us do the reasoning, identify an akida, make a judgment, and therefore parts or bits of it are then taken from the bigger context or a bigger hadith, so it gets preserved less, and
Mm.
parts get preserved more.
No, absolutely. And this is, I'd say, in retrospect, this was quite important because the Ahlul Hadith faced off against the Ahlul Rai. So it had a polemic utility to it as well. Let's not forget that our scholars had to engage in certain debates with the Mu'tazila, with perhaps the Jahmiya or whichever sect was in vogue at the time.
Hmm.
So it had a practical utility as well. And furthermore,
Just for context purposes, can we talk about or just mention who the Ahlul Rai are and who Ahlul Hadith are?
okay, the Ahlul Rai were primarily centered in Iraq, in Kufa, and they had their own method of inferring religious prescriptions from the Quran and the Sunnah Mutawatir. They believed that, well, Islam was a logical religion. We can abide by certain deductive principles and then arrive at a correct opinion. And we would utilize Islamic sources for that. It would not be arbitrary. We would not simply philosophize. We would use religion and extrapolate rulings from that. We wouldn't need to confirm them
Hmm.
because, as you know, God in the Quran has said, use your mind to
Hmm.
arrive at the truth.
Yeah.
The Ahlul Hadith, however, had a different idea. The Ahlul Hadith were more orthodox. They were of the opinion that we cannot say anything about religion ourselves. And Ahlul Rai, the term itself means people of opinion, and polemically, they were called the people of whims and desires
Hmm.
because it was said that they can bend religion to their will, which is not what they were doing.
Yeah. I
You'll,
mean, if I remember correctly, people like Bukhari, they were considered part of Ahlul Hadith, right?
yes, Yes.
People like Imam Ibn Hanbal were considered part of Ahlul Hadith. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
As opposed to this, the group that relied more on um, Hadith, right, and the text of the Hadith and what is directly written in Hadith, the Sunni fiqh group, the Hanafis, they were referred to as Ahlul Rai by the Ahlul Hadith. Now,
Yes.
whether they refer to themselves as Ahlul Rai is a different question, but that's the charge against them.
Yes. Yes, it is.
Hmm. So, I mean,
Um,
even though Hanafis don't necessarily, not rely on Hadith, they do rely on Hadith as well.
I wouldn't say that's the case in classical Hanafi fiqh. You
Right.
will find that when we take a look at the development of the Hanafi fiqh itself, things changed after Ibn Hammam. He was a muhaddith of the Hanafi fiqh who
Hmm.
technically created this current and produced this scholarly tradition within the Hanafi tradition, which advocated for a more hadith-centric approach.
Right.
And it culminated in the scholars of Deoband and then Zafar Ahmad Usmani, who essentially
Hmm.
um, became Ahlul Hadith, essentially.
Hmm. Hmm.
It
All
was
right.
never Hanafi
Now
practice.
we've jumped almost 1400 years there.
We've jumped
So
almost 1400 years,
almost
but
1300 years
yes,
maybe.
Ibn Hammam is
Hmm.
probably a ninth century scholar, Hijri.
Hmm. Hmm.
But if you compare Ibn Hammam's views with what's been reported about Isa ibn Aban, a very
Hmm.
early Hanafi,
Hmm.
or with Qadi Abu Bakr al-Jassas, a
Hmm.
relatively later
Hmm.
Hanafi, you will
Hmm.
find them being more Ahlul Rai centric,
Right.
relying more on reasoning, that
Hmm.
is qiyas, ijtihad,
Hmm.
and the Ibn Hammam and scholars after him relying more on perhaps obscure traditions, but
Yeah.
traditions nonetheless from the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba or the Musannaf of Abdul Razak, which prove Hanafi fiqh. They do.
Hmm. Hmm.
Not like they don't.
Hmm.
But that was never the Hanafi method.
Right. From a method point of view, sticking uh, just to what is written in the text, that is not their approach.
It is
Uh,
not there.
yeah. So, I mean, the Ahlul Hadith, they called Hanafis Ahlul Rai. I don't know if they necessarily subscribe to it. But then you also mentioned the Mu'tazila. Now, Mu'tazila is somewhat significantly different group from Hanafis. I believe they were in the same area as well,
They were in the same areas.
geographically. Yeah.
They were in the same areas geographically,
Yeah.
and there is a great deal of similarity. We,
Hmm.
before I actually talk about the similarity, I'd just like to say there's a difference between the Mu'tazila as a school of theology
Yeah.
and the Hanafis as a school of law.
Right.
One of the greatest scholars of the Mu'tazili tradition,
Hmm.
Qadi, I believe it was, the name eludes me, wait, take a second.
Hmm.
Qadi Abdul Jabbar, yes. Qadi Abdul Jabbar was a Mu'tazili in Aqidah, that is theology, and then a Shafi'i
Hmm.
in what we call the Furu.
Right. In fiqh, let's say.
In fiqh,
Hmm.
let's say that. Fiqh was
Hmm.
always secondary to theology. Now,
Hmm.
Qadi Abdul Jabbar was an outlier
Hmm.
in the sense that the Shafi'i approach was
Hmm.
not compatible with the Mu'tazili approach. It simply wasn't.
Hmm.
But at the same time, Abdul Jabbar was himself a Qadi.
Hmm.
He was a state-appointed jurist.
Right.
Yet that didn't seem to bother him. But with most Mu'tazilis, we will find that they thought that the Hanafi approach to law was more compatible with their theological outlook.
Right.
So there was some level of similarity, and this is very risky territory because we have advanced discussions on usul today. We have the
Hmm.
usul, we have the usul of Juwayni, or we have the usul
Hmm.
of Al-Amidi, but we don't have the usul of our classical scholars,
Right.
of our earliest scholars. We don't know what Imam Ghazali
Hmm.
said. We can't ever be sure of what Imam Abu Hanifa's epistemology was.
Right. So you're saying that it's they kind of formalized later on.
It was formalized much later on, so it's never really easy to make these statements, even though they're made in mass very often, but it's
Hmm.
uh, not safe, let's just say that. It's not academic.
All
But
right.
moving on, Now, we find that ahadith were condensed. The text wasn't really changed, but parts of it were taken and parts of it were used instead. Now, we had older collections from from a number of people. Ibn Jurayj had one, Waki had one. These are all famous scholars of hadith from the era of the Tabi'in. Urwa ibn Zubair had one. All now, well, Urwa was burned by him, so we don't have access to that. But regarding Ibn Jurayj or Waki or all of these people, um, their collections were absorbed. Their booklets, they were never
Hmm.
formally published. They circulated amongst the scholars as a teacher's notes, perhaps. And as those scholars transmitted them forward, and you arrive at the people who begin to collect hadiths,
Hmm.
for example, Imam Malik,
Hmm.
then all of those booklets culminate in those books.
Right.
Now, the process of hadith collection, there's a bit of debate regarding where it started from. It's often said that the first person to write a book of hadith was Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri at the behest of Hazrat Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. That's the standard idea that's been put forward. Everyone's heard of it. But there are variants. Some people say it was not Umar ibn Abdul Aziz who commissioned Zuhri. Some people say it wasn't Zuhri who started it. Some people say Zuhri was simply picking the task up from another person. But I suppose what something we can agree upon is that it started in the Umayyad court.
Hmm. Are we
And
talking about like formalized or large collections of hadith?
not formalized collections, the actual process of perhaps publishing those collections.
Okay.
Publishing in the sense of that day when you would have them propagated throughout different corners of the Islamic empire.
No, but then when we say, when I'm okay, so publishing is one thing, but the methodologies of hadith evaluation, for example, the kind Bukhari came up with later on, uh, had somebody done something like that before, or at this stage it was just collection?
It was primarily collection. There's an
Right.
outlier to that collection. Before actually I talk about the outlier, let's just talk
Hmm.
about Zohri's alleged collection.
Right.
It existed in some way, shape, or form. We know
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
It's also said that the texts of those ahadith had no chains.
Okay.
They had no chain. So, where Zohri got those, how he came about them is a mystery, and the book isn't extant, hence we can't really judge it either. But
Is this I mean, is this something that earlier scholars have noted somewhere that
yes,
they were
uh,
missing the chains?
yes, Suyuti has mentioned this, that this
Okay.
event, they didn't have chains. Now, this obviously was quite contentious in Western academia as well, because now you have, well, Muslims themselves will
Because
say,
somebody can easily claim that now you once you had your text, you invented your chain
yes,
afterwards.
exactly, as we call it, back projection.
Hmm.
That was the case for Zuhri's text. However, simultaneously, we have, once again, texts from Hammam bin Munabbih, and we have texts from a number of different people. And
Hmm.
the sheer magnitude of the chains, well, says that there was definitely some historicity. But
Hmm.
we can ignore Zuhri's collection for the simple reason that that it was largely abandoned.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
was never in vogue. You can't ever you won't find people quoting from it.
Right.
It was a
So a quick
manual.
question over here. Now, what is the primary tradition within hadith preservation?
Yes.
Are we saying it's written or it's oral? Because if it's written and let's say the isnad or the chains are missing in writing, maybe they were preserved in oral tradition.
See, we won't ever be able to arrive at that with a certainty
Hmm.
because this period of Islamic history is relatively dark.
Hmm.
It, we had books which perhaps documented this. It's entirely possible, but those simply didn't survive the
Hmm.
uh, annals of history. But generally, um, this text prepared by Zohri, which didn't have chains, that can be dismissed because perhaps a few decades later, the Abbasid Emperor Abu Ja'far al-Mansur asked Imam Malik to compile a book with authentic chains.
Mm.
that could be relied upon and be used to judge different corners of the empire. Now, Imam Malik complied with the idea of writing this book. He
Mm.
rejected that it be imposed on the different people of Islam.
Right.
So that's when he formulated the Muwatta.
Mm.
The Muwatta is the first actual book which utilizes hadith chains formally. And it was ahead of its time in the sense that Imam Malik valued authenticity. You have a few years after that where Abu Dawud al-Tayalisi is writing his Musnad. It's not the first Musnad, but it's the earliest extant Musnad we have. And the term Musnad means a book of hadith, a collection of hadith that is arranged in regards to the companions rather than topic. So all the narrations from, for example, Sayyidina Ali would be in one place. All of the narrations from Sayyidina Umar would be in one place. Abu Huraira would be in one place within the book. Um, and the point of having Musnad collections was so that whatever data we're receiving that is attributed to these companions, let's just preserve that. And of the Masanid, the most important is the Musnad of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. It has close to 28, 29,000 narrations. And it was venerated to the extent that it was said if a narration isn't in the Musnad, then it isn't a narration at all. Because even though Imam Ahmad was not compiling the book to ensure authenticity, he was ensuring, and this was a principle of his, that if these narrations are tested, then they will likely prove to be authentic. I have sifted out all the major telltale forgeries. All the undisputed forgeries have been filtered out. Now, whatever we are left with is contentious. Once that is tested, we will arrive at a more refined product, which is exactly what happened. You will find that Imam Ahmad taught Imam Bukhari. You will find that Imam Ahmad and Imam Abu Dawud had relatively close relations. You will find all of that. So uh, the process of hadith went through uh, a gradual timeline where you had data that was filtered and then further filtered, and then finally we arrived at the Sahih. So just a small rundown of this. You had the Musnad collections first, which documented all of the narrations we have from the companions. Almost right after that, with the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, which these things were happening simultaneously. It would be wrong to say these were, points on a timeline. No, they happened simultaneously with overlap. As that was happening, Abdul Razak as-Sanani was compiling his Musannaf. Musannaf works are those that organize narrations by topic. So perhaps it can be said that, okay, they received data from the Musnad. They immediately started to compartmentalize it, immediately started to read and analyze those traditions and make chapter headings about them. Oh, so these narrations are about financial matters. These narrations are about hudud. These narrations are about iman. And that is what happened. You started organizing them. And then Ibn Abi Shayba organized them into his Musannaf, which is largely more popular than Abdul Razak. Abdul Razak was read up until the 8th century, and people like Az-Zahabi are said to have narrated it. People like, I believe, Al-Mizzi, yes, are said to have narrated it as well. But post the 8th century, it went out of use, and we can find why it went out of use. Everyone got whatever they wanted out of it. They'd analyzed it, they found, okay, well, now we have better books of hadith, so it's time to rely on those. And they moved on. Something similar happened to Musnad Imam Ahmad, to the extent that you had Al-Muzanni remark that it's almost impossible to find a manuscript of the book now, even though it's been compiled by a mujtahid. So all of that kept happening. Now, we can largely say that the Musnad collections, and you had a lot of them. It's not like Abu Dawud Tayalisi or Ahmad bin Hanbal are the only ones. You had books like Musnad Abd ibn Humayd. You had books like Musnad Ishaq ibn Rahawayh. You had, who was a contemporary of Imam Ahmad and a very good friend of his and a disciple to some extent. You had the Musnad of Abu Yala. Abu Yala al-Khalili was a Hanbali. So again, it's you can't clearly delineate the different stages of Hadith collection because Abu Yala obviously comes much after Imam Ahmad and Al-Bazzar too,
Right.
still compiling their books.
So I mean, just summarizing it, so we are talking about, from a documentation point of view, we're talking about, let's say, three stages. First being the Musnad collections, right? And you mentioned that Imam Malik had already made authenticity a point in his own compilation,
Yes, but
right?
that's let me just add something to that. Imam Malik did that because the Muwatta is not really a book of Hadith as much as it's a book of
Right, right,
to
right.
rely on jurisprudence or to make sure the book
But
was.
but his let's say his preference or his caution, was that taken forward? Let's say when we see the Musnad collections, were they also bringing in the isnad? Were they being cautious about authenticity?
The Isnad, yes. So, for example, in Musnad al-Tayalisi, you will find complete chains.
Hmm.
That was, major because complete chains were something you wouldn't typically find in
Hmm.
a very early collection, but it had started. Yet, you will not find an insistence on authenticity. So,
Hmm.
branching out here a bit, I'm sure you're familiar with the Tarikh of Tabari. He
Hmm.
mentions in his Muqaddimah for that book that
Hmm.
I'm just compiling whatever I get,
Right.
right? I'm not really making a point of authenticity. That's for the later generations to do. So
Right.
people like Tayalisi did that as well. People like Ibn
Okay.
Abi Shayba did that as well.
Hmm.
But the goal was to make sure that the information that we will pass on is organized.
Right.
The
So
first,
in the Musnad collections, we've got gathering of a lot of information, and the text is gathered as well as the chains. Next
yes,
stage, Musannaf, you're talking more about organizational changes in the sense that how it was organized, and put into chapters, and
mm,
relevant topics which could be used for people who are doing fiqh, or people
yes,
who just want to study something. And then at a later time, these third level collections appear, which are called the Sahih collections, in which
yes,
an authenticity methodology has been put together as well, and it's applied on those
yes,
hadith that have been received from whichever collection in the past.
yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
So, going along here, we found, for example, in the Muslim collections that with Imam Ahmad, authenticity actually starts.
Hmm.
We need to look at who Imam Ahmad's circle of people was. There was Ishaq bin Rabi,
Hmm.
a master critic of Hadith. There was Imam Yahya ibn Ma'in, once again, an excellent critic of Rijal, that is the science of men and narrators of Hadith. You had Imam Ali ibn al-Madini, once again, extraordinary critic of Hadith. He was known as the Sultan of Hadith for the reason that he could find the illat, the hidden defects, the intricacies of how defective a narrator was, because sometimes defects would not be apparent.
Hmm.
So this was a circle of people. And now, given the fact that these people existed, and even before them, Shoba
Hmm.
existed, who had very strict conditions from who he would narrate from.
Hmm.
It wasn't a question of what are we writing down. It was a question of, okay, will we narrate from this person or not? Will we narrate what
Right.
we from this person or not? Imam Ahmad decided to at least come up with an idea that said, I will simply gather what I think has value. It
Hmm.
might be wrong. I'm not going to sift through it.
Hmm.
But the outright forgeries, as I said earlier, the undisputed forgeries, the undisputed weak narrations, which could be of no value because there are different kinds of weak narrations. He didn't count those. He added what he thought, if put to the test, perhaps could prove reliable. So this is
Right.
where authenticity really starts for formal hadith collection that is detached from jurisprudence.
Hmm. So
Detached.
this Musnad collection that you're talking about, Musnad Ahmad, right?
Yes.
So did they have any principles by which they were deciding what to bring in, or what to label as forgery? I mean, were they going by trustworthiness of the person narrating, or the chain from which is coming, memory? Did the text seem logical or illogical? Were they doing any text criticism there? How did they know what is a forgery and what isn't?
It relied primarily on the people who were narrating the hadith,
Trustworthiness of the narrator.
trustworthiness, and it also relied on one thing.
Hmm.
Rather than perhaps going very far back up the chain, it was also about, okay, are we taking from this person? For example, if
Hmm.
a hadith is narrated by Shoba,
Hmm.
it was assumed that Shoba only narrates from people who he believes are worthy of narration.
Okay.
So he'd document that. Perhaps it was not the case.
Hmm.
They were documented. And simultaneously, this would go wrong as well. So you have narrators like Ibn Lahiya, regarding whom there was contention after Imam Ahmad as to whether or not he was reliable.
Hmm.
So the issue is that there was never really a trend to document your principles as you were compiling a tradition book.
Hmm.
That didn't exist. So much so that even Imam Bukhari never did that. Imam Muslim did, but other than Imam Muslim, no one has.
Hmm.
So
So are you saying that Imam Bukhari did not actually document any principles of hadith
yes,
evaluation?
he did not. He left it to inference. So you have Ibn
But
Hajar, who
don't I mean, isn't it the case that there are differences of principle between Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim, and Imam Muslim,
yes,
made his compilation
no, no,
later?
absolutely. There are absolutely differences, but we found that
Hmm.
on the basis of discussions that Imam Bukhari had with Imam Muslim.
Right. Not based on any kind of book, which is
No,
called
no.
like the principle of evaluation of hadith.
Yes.
Here are my
Imam Bukhari.
seven principles.
Yes, nothing like that.
Okay.
Even in his Tarikh al-Kabir, where he'll perhaps mention in passing, once again in
Hmm.
passing, oh, I found this wrong with him. So we can extrapolate that perhaps, okay, this
Right.
is what he meant. But the issue then arises that expressions of hadith, for example, there's a difference between Imam Bukhari saying Laysa bishshay, that is, this narrator is nothing, and Imam Yahya ibn Ma'in saying this narrator is Laysa bishshay. There's a great deal of difference.
Hmm.
Ibn Ma'in would say that about about almost everyone at one
Right.
point or another, because it depended on the narration and what the state of the other people
Hmm.
was, not just that specific person. But Imam Bukhari was known to be more tempered in his criticism of people. So he would say that when he thought the person was weak, actually weak, incapable
Hmm.
of being relied upon.
Hmm.
So, given this very confusing aspect of the hadith sciences, um, it's anyone's guess really what Imam Bukhari's um, principles were. But nonetheless, Mustafa Al-Azmi has documented them,
Hmm.
Zubayr documented them, Jonathan Brown has documented them. To some extent, Goldziher has done so as well. So it exists.
Yeah. So I mean, people later people must have inferred those
Yes,
principles. They must have
correct.
written about them
Absolutely.
later
Ibn
on.
Hajar in Fathul Bari goes on and on.
Hmm.
Suyuti goes on and on.
Hmm.
Any major, for example, Ibn Battal also
Hmm.
goes on. So everyone has an idea of what the ideas were, and we've arrived at an idea. So I'll just talk about that then.
Hmm.
Once you're done with the Musnad collection,
Yeah.
once again, there's overlap. So it's not like completely chronological, but once by and large you've collected the relevant data,
Hmm.
you have people like Imam Bukhari who decide it's time to refine it. I
Yep.
need to compile a book upon which I can rely on to issue verdicts because Imam Bukhari was a jurist, and upon which other people can rely upon as well, without having to worry about whether this source is good or not, whether it can be relied upon or not. So he came up with the Sahih. And in the Sahih, it's a jami. That means it doesn't just have narrations of Islamic law, it has narrations on Aqidah, it has narrations on manners, it has narrations on a number of topics,
Hmm.
and tafsir as well, not just a law. So in that, he has certain conditions. Now, if you'll allow me, I'll just read those conditions out to you. I have
Yeah.
them written down. Said Imam Bukhari is regarded to have the most strict conditions for hadith acceptance. There was likely no one more strict. So the narrator must be of a very high grade in terms of his personal character. He must be of strong morals. He cannot be some sort of philanderer. He cannot be some sort of liar. He cannot be some sort of immoral person. He must first and foremost be a good person. He then must also be a very honest person regarding whom no one can say this man has told a lie. Then he must be of a very high grade in terms of his literary and academic standard. He will not be a normal person. He will be a scholar. We will not take from normal people. And then this is perhaps what sets up Imam Bukhari apart from all the other people. He insists that there must be positive confirmation of a narrator of hadith meeting the person he is narrating from. You would have, for example, Imam Muslim does not have this. For him, it is enough that if two people lived in the same area, well, they must have interacted. It's unlikely for two contemporaries who are operating in the same field to not have interacted when this entire field relies upon interaction, right? But Imam Bukhari said, no, I need positive confirmation that these two people have met. Otherwise, I will not accept their narrations. So Mustafa Al-Azmi actually writes this. It is difficult to obtain complete data about every scholar. In fact, we do not have complete information about any scholar's list of students. There is no data about it, but we have rough ideas. There was a difference of opinion relating to this matter between Bukhari and Muslim. In Muslim's opinion, if two scholars lived together where it was possible for them to learn from each other, then even if they have no positive information about their meetings, we should accept their ahadith regarding their isnad to be unbroken, provided that they were not practicing tadlis. Tadlis, you will recall, is when a narrator hides the name of another narrator. Bukhari did not agree with this position. He insisted on positive evidence of learning and teaching. He did not consider even this condition sufficient and required further scrutiny in selecting authorities. So, the picture I'm sure you get is that Bukhari was a very strict critic of hadith. So, once again, I'm just going to quote these experts here because it's a lot easier since this is, once again, very dangerous territory. So, Azmi writes, to explain it more simply, let's take the example of Zohri, who had a great many students. Imam Zohri is one of the most prolific narrators of hadith, one of the early hadith tradents, and often you'll find he is the madar, the central figure, after which the narration splinters off into 100 different chains. So narrators from Zohri who possessed the high quality of itqan, that is accuracy, and then hifz, memory, and a lengthy companionship with Zohri accompanying him even in his journey. So the best students, your people you would give an A in your class. The second group was adl, morally upright like the first group, but they did not spend sufficient time with Zohri to be able to remember his hadith thoroughly. Because every hadith master would review what he had taught throughout the year. You would have recensions of whatever booklet they were making their students write every year, where they would filter out something, add in something, edit a text if necessary because they had missed something. And those but they did not spend sufficient time with Zohri to be able to remember his hadith thoroughly and with accuracy, and thus we placed them a little below the first group. Then there were people who lived along with Zohri, like the first group, but have been criticized by scholars. Right? They have criticism on them. Perhaps their memory was lacking. Perhaps something else was wrong with them. Those who have been criticized by the scholars and meanwhile did not spend much time in the lectures of Zohri, these are the fourth people. They are contentious. They are not very highly valued because they are, first of all, criticized, and then we cannot also say that despite their uh, errors or despite their weaknesses, they had any real connection with Zohri beyond the odd lesson. And then lastly, those who are held as weak narrators or not known to early scholars. So in his Sahih, Imam Bukhari mostly recorded the ahadith narrated by the first group, but sometimes recorded the ahadith of the second group. Right? So narrations of people who possessed the highest standard of qualities and then also the highest amount of time spent with Zohri, as well as the people who were morally upright, but perhaps did not spend as much time with Zohri. but they still did meet him. Hence, a connection is established. Now, Imam Muslim recorded the ahadith of the third group as well, those who lived with Zuhri, like the first group, but have been criticized by the scholars. And then Nasai, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah have almost all of them in their books. So this is your general idea of how hadith were collected. Within that, um, Imam Bukhari said, Imam Bukhari never said he collected all the Sahih traditions. He never said that, nor did he make an effort to collect all of them. So this inspired people like uh, yeah, this inspired people like Hakim, yes, who compiled his Mustadrak. Now, we found that Hakim's Mustadrak is a very contentious book of hadith. He claims to be using the conditions of Imam Muslim and Imam Bukhari. Now, Imam Muslim penned his conditions down. Imam Bukhari did not. This automatically creates an issue because it required a lot of research to, first of all, infer what Imam Bukhari's conditions are. So when a scholar is claiming to collect traditions on the conditions of Bukhari himself, then naturally this led to a problem. And hence, Al-Zahabi remarked about Hakim's Mustadrak, it would have been better had he not compiled it, because it put a lot of people in a lot of very difficult situations. So, most famously, and this is a very polemical point, the narration that Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu was born in the Kaaba. That narration is found in the Mustadrak of Imam Hakim. He says it's authentic on the conditions of Bukhari and Muslim. He also goes as far as to say that the narration is mutawatir. So therefore, according to him, it's a confirmed historical fact. But when you critically analyze it, as Zahabi has, it first of all turns out that no, the chain does not meet even the fifth standard of people that have, fourth standard of people who have been mentioned. It's a very lax chain. Is the event mutawatir? Absolutely not. It's been narrated by maybe two chains that are equally flawed. And Imam Hakim was using the term mutawatir to mean anything that was well known among the people, regardless of whether or not it had a chain. So these are some of the issues you have with the Sahih. Now, there were different collections of the Sahih as well. So keep the four conditions I spoke about in mind, where every scholar then had his own idea of what it meant for a narration to be Sahih. It could fall from or be confined to only the first people. As someone like Ibn Hazm, if he was compiling a book, that is what would happen. Because we must remember, Ibn Hazm criticized any tradition that he thought had any issue in it. But say someone like Ibn Hibban. Ibn Hibban was a lot more lax. So you will find that his book, Sahih Ibn Hibban, he compiled a Sahih as well, has traditions that go to, well, the fifth level of people as well. You will find that. Similarly, you will find well, there's a number of books. There's Sahih Ibn Khuzaimah as well. Technically, Tirmidhi's Sahih. Tirmidhi's Jami is also technically a Sahih. It's Al-Jami of Sahih, Tirmidhi. But, of course, regarding Tirmidhi himself, um, Tirmidhi, as Mustafa Al-Azmi writes, records a hadith of the first, second, third, and fourth group, but he describes the weak narrators. So at least he points it out. So this links back to the idea of whether a weak hadith can be used or not. Tirmidhi thinks yes. And of the Kutub Sitta, the Sunni canon of hadith, you have Bukhari, you have Muslim, but and then you have four other books. But of those four other books, the most utilized is the Jami of Imam Tirmidhi, such that it
Right,
can be said that no hadith, or perhaps three hadith, according to some people, are the only ones that have not been put into use by a jurist that come from Tirmidhi.
right.
So it's a very venerated book.
Hmm. Just a quick question there. In these Sahih books, even though the title is Sahih, the Sahih title is used in the title in most of their names. Are there any hadith which are not Sahih?
Oh, yes, certainly. So
I
let's
mean,
start.
were there as in they knew it and
Yeah,
they still put it in there, or was it declared not Sahih later on?
both are true actually.
Okay.
You have in Imam Bukhari's Sahih, you have traditions called muallaq.
Mm-hmm.
Those are used as chapter headings.
Right.
And then often even beyond chapter headings, he'll write a chapter, for example, um, well, not the prohibition of music, but the prohibition of wearing silk clothes, if memory serves me right.
Hmm.
In that chapter, he brought a narration which said something along the lines of, there will come a time when people from my ummah will make
Hmm.
halal, wine halal, and wearing silk halal, right?
Yeah.
We all heard that tradition.
Yeah.
The chain for that tradition is weak. It's
Hmm.
muallaq.
Hmm. But
And it was,
that's supposed to be quite well-known tradition, and not just that. I read somewhere that all four schools of fiqh, let's say based on that hadith, agree that, for example, music is haram because music is mentioned in there.
well,
So
that,
did they all accept this hadith despite the
well,
fact that?
no, you will find different opinions in
Right.
every school of Islam. A lot of Maliki scholars were of the opinion that it's fine.
Hmm.
Hanafis also held that opinion. A few Shafis did as well.
Hmm.
But even if we go beyond the fiqh debate, I personally believe the hadith is authentic. It's been reported by other chains as well. So maybe
Right.
Imam Bukhari knew that.
Yeah.
But um, Ibn Hazm did not think that.
Hmm.
Most famously, Ibn Hazm in his Al-Mahalla criticizes narration.
Hmm.
He says this is fabricated. Goes on to
Okay.
say it's fabricated. Ash-Shawkani upholds that, by the way.
Hmm.
So there were weak traditions in Bukhari.
And Ibn Hazm is a much later scholar.
Ibn Hazm is a much later scholar, but he is still classical enough.
Hmm. No, but then what
He
I'm trying to say is that when you come in later, you've got access to more information. You've got access to, you've got the possibility of making a better judgment, let's say.
That's not necessarily true about the Islamic sciences or the Muslim world because
Hmm.
I just mentioned the importance of Jami Tirmidhi, right?
Hmm.
I said there are very few traditions in it that have not been put into practice by some jurist.
Yeah.
Hilariously, Ibn Hazm never had access to Jami Tirmidhi. He never knew the book existed.
Right.
Imagine that,
Interesting.
such an important resource
Hmm.
never
Hmm.
reached an
Hmm.
important man
Hmm.
in an important area. He lived in Andalus, the intellectual capital of the world at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Reached him. So it really depended where you were living.
Hmm.
So, for example, right, these Muallak riwayat, they're zaif. Some, no, none of them are fabricated. I would never say that, but they're definitely weak.
Hmm.
Some have corroboration, some don't have corroboration. This one, for
Hmm.
example, does have corroboration, but in total, there are 1,725
Hmm.
of this nature.
Okay. That's a big
17.
number.
That's a big number.
Hmm.
Uh, and I believe Ibn Hazm tracked them all down and wrote them in a book.
Hmm.
And now we criticize those chains quite routinely. But what's also
Hmm.
true is Bukhari knew these narrations were weak. He
Hmm.
was simply adding them for an experienced jurist to
Hmm.
complete an argument. But regarding
Okay.
that point you mentioned, hilariously, Imam Bukhari does not bring that hadith when he's discussing the impermissibility of music. Just saying. He doesn't.
Okay. Okay.
Even though it's a style of his to use the same narration for different chapters
Yeah.
and
Yeah. They
right.
do repeat.
Yes, a lot of repetition. So much so that I think from the 7,000 or so narrations in Bukhari, if you cut the repetition down, it's down to 2,500 or something.
Okay.
So, yeah, he didn't use it there. But on that note, we will find that Imam Daraqutni in his, I believe, Kitab al-Tatabbu, yes, that's what it's called, criticized over 80 narrators
Hmm.
and almost 110 chains.
Hmm.
Now, Mustafa Azmi says 110, Zubair Siddiqui says 200. Jonathan Brown has his own number, but that depends on how you number traditions as well. But point being,
Hmm.
he criticized over 100 chains.
Hmm.
And the point of criticizing them was to be a good academic.
Yeah.
So, Imam Daraqutni has his own Sunan, the Sunan of Daraqutni, and it has fabricated narrations in it as well. His own standard was not that high.
Hmm. Hmm.
Point was that we have a book that is claiming to be completely authentic,
Hmm.
that we are claiming is second only to the Book of God.
Hmm.
Such a serious
Hmm.
um, such a serious title like
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
demands that it meet that criteria. So he did whatever he could.
Hmm.
So among the narrations he criticizes, Jonathan Brown's done some work on it. A number of scholars in Western academia have analyzed it. And the conclusion of all of those people was that this doesn't really affect Bukhari's general book because
Hmm.
Imam Bukhari brings the same narration with multiple chains.
Okay.
So if, for example, one of those chains is weak,
Hmm.
fine. The other chain is perfectly reliable.
Hmm.
The narrator, one of those narrators is weak, well, we have the same hadith without that one narrator as well.
Hmm.
There's no
As long as the matan is exactly the same.
as long as the matan is exact.
And there is no difference, let's say, in the items mentioned in a list, for example. One
Yes.
says five, one says six, one says seven, let's say.
No, I mean, no, that's happened as well. It happened in Imam Muslim's Sahih.
Hmm.
Actually, yes. If memory serves me right, Zubair Siddiqui says both Bukhari and Muslim were both criticized. That's why the numbers
Hmm.
are 200. Azmi is just talking about
Hmm.
Bukhari.
Hmm.
For example, in Imam Muslim's Sahih, that famous narration about the 10 signs of Qiyamah,
Hmm.
the list differs depending on which
Yeah.
variant you pick up.
Yeah.
So that exists. It
Yeah.
would be it would be a lie to say it doesn't. But there's no
Hmm.
practical effect. The
Hmm.
narrations themselves are typically fine.
Hmm. Okay.
And no, but there is one little aspect that I suppose needs to be mentioned, though I
Hmm.
was hoping to bring this up in our next lecture.
Okay.
Because this one, as you can understand, was very hadith centric. I haven't criticized anything. There was no evaluation of whether this was good or whether this was bad. This was simply a statement of the normative facts. We'll interpret them.
Hmm.
Yet, it seems pertinent to bring up the fact that Bukhari and Muslim were later canonized.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Goldziher, an Orientalist, and Jonathan Brown agrees with him here, as do a number of Muslim scholars, that up until the early days of these books,
Hmm.
you got criticism. You got criticism of them. It wasn't unheard of. You would
Yeah.
find
Yeah.
Ibn Hazm, I mean, he's not that late. You will find him criticizing things. Sure. But post Imam Nawawi, post Ibn Salah, um, you'll find a change in attitude. I'm not saying they caused it. Jonathan,
Hmm.
they caused it. But there's a trend where you find, okay, these books are now being venerated. It is being
Hmm.
treated as heresy to deviate from them.
Hmm.
So this,
Which is also, I suppose, not very unnatural in the sense that when things are developing, they are developing organically and they are building up slowly. Contemporaries tend to criticize, people of their time more. But as time passes,
yes,
either the criticism goes down or it increases. In
yes.
the sense, if they are rejected, the criticism goes through the roof. If they are accepted, it is slowly, smoothed out and, minimized.
Eventually, yes. But perhaps what is most interesting about Imam Bukhari
Hmm.
and Imam Bukhari really is he wasn't liked by the Hanafis
Hmm.
and he wasn't particularly liked by the Ashab al-Hadith either.
Okay, that's strange.
That's strange, yes.
Hmm.
Now, by Ashab al-Hadith, I don't mean any of the serious people. I don't mean
Hmm.
Ali ibn Madini. All of these
Hmm.
people respected him. They
Hmm.
authored his books, all of
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
No. You will find that in his local region, and some people here and there
Hmm.
disagreed with what he said about the Quran being created or uncreated.
Okay. That was a problem of Kalam theology. That was a different
Problem of
issue.
Kalam theology, and every time a Hadith scholar decides to delve into Kalam, this happens.
Hmm.
Hence,
This wasn't really their business anyway.
this really was not their business. Hence, what Imam Ahmad says
Hmm.
best, not even Imam Ahmad, one of Imam Ahmad's students says, we shouldn't, I refuse to answer this question.
Hmm.
He says, Wallahu alam.
Hmm.
That this falls beyond the purview of a hadith. You will not find a hadith which clearly states the Quran is created or uncreated.
Hmm.
Forgeries would say that, yes, but
Yeah.
actual tradition. And then the Hanafis did not like him because his entire book was technically a refutation of their fiqh.
Yeah.
From the method of namaz to
Hmm.
financial transactions to hudud,
Hmm.
everything was made to reject the local Hanafi tradition he was from.
Hmm.
And hence you had the Ahlul Hadith and Ahlul Rai both having a
Hmm.
problem with Imam Bukhari.
Hmm.
So that meant he died a very sad life
Hmm.
in very sad circumstances. Uh,
Hmm.
he was had to go into self-imposed exile and just passed away in relative anonymity. And that's where we arrive at our next issue, and that's the transmission of these books.
Hmm.
Now, Mufti Abu Lath, for example, a few years ago, really
Yeah.
criticized this a lot, and
What he called the Bukhari Gate, and then it
I,
became a bit of a sensation.
but that's not true.
Hmm. Hmm.
His allegations were very, very exaggerated,
Polemical, I suppose.
very polemical
Hmm.
because how a book is transmitted is not really relevant,
Hmm.
specifically when it's a book of hadith. So, for example, about Abu Dawud at-Tayalisi's Musnad, he didn't write it.
Hmm.
It was compiled by one of his students, Yunus ibn Habib.
Hmm.
So it doesn't matter whether it was written by Bukhari or not, but there were telltale signs that when we corroborate the book with other independent data of Bukhari,
Hmm.
we'll find that yes, this matches up.
Okay.
Uh, so, for example, one of the telltale signs of Tayalisi's Musnad
Hmm.
was Tayalisi knew a lot about Shoba. He specialized in Shoba's traditions, and we found that specialization of Shoba's traditions in his Musnad. Hence,
Right.
barring some minor editing, it was largely Tayalisi's book. Similarly, with Bukhari, let's just assume Firabri was the only person on planet Earth to narrate it forward.
Hmm.
First of all, Firabri was regarded authentic by everyone. There's not a
Hmm.
single Hadith scholar who actually called him a liar or said there was something wrong with him.
Hmm.
But let's assume that yes, this very advanced piece of um, of Islamic literature was only
Hmm.
transmitted by one person.
Hmm.
It still does not matter because it adds up with everything else we know about Bukhari.
Yeah. And I mean, his contemporaries has had plenty of time to,
Absolutely.
jump on this and refute everything that they were putting
Everything
forward.
Firabri was saying, yes, Imam
Yeah.
Muslim was alive, Tirmidhi was alive, Abu
Hmm.
Dawud was alive.
Hmm.
So there was nothing stopping them.
If this was such a contentious thing,
Yes.
well, at least it wasn't contentious apparently, because nobody was, bringing it down like that.
Yes.
But let's say if there was some issue with it, they had plenty of time to identify
Absolutely.
stuff like
No
that.
one brought this up for a
Hmm.
very long time. And I believe the first person to bring it up was Mufti Abul Lath himself. I don't know of anybody
Maybe I'm sure he's referencing somebody in the past, but maybe it's
else.
it's 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 not well-founded opinion. It's more of a fringe opinion.
Uh, See, the thing with our
Hmm.
tradition is when we look at a hadith
Hmm.
or when we would look at a book of hadith, we look at it from the people who are narrating it,
Right.
right? Seldom will we find perhaps a contemporary agreeing with, or a contemporary, for example, Zahabi, right? Zahabi did not witness a lot of the narrators he wrote about.
Hmm.
He received traditions from Yahya ibn Ma'in or Lath ibn Sa'ad or whosoever else regarding a narrator.
Hmm.
Regarding a narrator. So, regarding Firabri, Mufti Abu Lath's primary criticism was that none of his contemporaries said he's authentic.
Hmm.
That was irrelevant to the people writing this hadith. They knew he narrated Imam Bukhari's Sahih. They found nothing contentious about him. They found
Hmm.
positive opinions of him, not necessarily from contemporaries, but people close enough
Hmm.
saying he's fine. Hence, the opinion was then
Yeah.
rejected.
I mean, I wonder, when we talk about this, documentation based criticism, right? Whether we have a document, whether it's still preserved or it's available or not, and whether it matches up or not. We see problems like these in Islamic history anyway,
Yeah.
right? And from modern criticism, it seems a lot of it comes from, you know Bible criticism that yeah, Western scholars may have developed, and their tradition is much more documentation based. In our Islamic tradition, it seems it was less documentation based, so the sensitivity to it is maybe less. I'm just throwing out a point out there because uh, do we have the same level of sensitivity, or do we have the same level of I would almost say obsession about documents, and then their precision in terms of what's written over there, and the versions and whatnot, or people have relied more on oral literature, they've relied more on what's been there in tradition and generally trusted that.
Okay, well, we've, our tradition has focused a lot on identity.
Hmm.
So regarding, for example, Bible criticism,
Hmm.
one aspect of the criticism is the authors of the Anajil are unknown. And I believe the latest theory is that they're all sourced from the Q manuscript.
I've heard at least two of them, right, because of certain similarities.
Yes,
So
certainly. Right.
somebody proposed
Somebody
that
proposed, actually,
there
the
was there
synoptic
was
gospel.
this Q manuscript behind both of them, from which both
Yeah.
of them came out. Yeah.
Not just both of them, the synoptic gospels, Mark
Hmm.
and Matthew are sourced
Hmm.
from Q manuscript. That's what's said.
Hmm. Hmm.
So identity is an issue over there. With us, a lot of care was taken making sure that identity is documented.
Okay. But see, but that's what I'm saying. When you say document means writing down. Are
Yes,
we as worried about writing down, or are we more worried about preserving, which could be done, orally
we
as
were
well?
more worried about transmission. I would,
Transmission.
yes, I would,
Documentation is a different issue, because if you
yes,
go into like some sort of archaeological project and you start digging out manuscripts from
manuscript, you
here
won't
and there
mind.
and start comparing them, that could be a problem, because
Yeah.
if people were not as sensitive to it, or they did not pay as much attention to it as later people would, uh, maybe they wouldn't they would take more care writing them down in more precise
No,
manner.
I'll be honest, this might
Hmm.
sound like apologetics to
Hmm.
some non-Muslim, but it's a fact. These
Hmm.
people or scholars of Hadith had what we would call photographic memories.
Hmm.
Every
Hmm.
single one of them, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Nasai, and Imam Bukhari is thought to have been practically a computer at this,
Hmm.
for the simple reason that he once walked into a mosque and everyone had heard that this man was some big traditionist
Hmm.
and he was coming to meet the teacher at that mosque. So
Hmm.
the teacher's students decided to test this man who was being venerated by their teachers. And they said, we're going to tell you our narrations and you will criticize them.
Hmm.
Jumbled the chains, they jumbled the text, and they narrated them.
Hmm.
All 10. And Imam Bukhari did not respond. And
Hmm.
then, naturally, as one would be in a polemic situation, and again, all of these people were barely 20 at the time, so you'd expect something like this.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, well, they were very happy with themselves until Imam Bukhari started to correct each and every single one of the hadith they had mentioned in reverse.
Hmm.
And that's when they realized, okay, this man knows everything
He knows the whole thing, backwards. So
backwards.
it's like,
So
okay.
he
No, but
started
the
from
point is, this, as you said, it might sound like apologies, but the thing is that certain things are part of certain tradition, right? Writing has been part of Western
yeah,
tradition much more, right?
yeah.
and and memorization has been part of Islamic tradition, much more significantly. And even today, when you see a child, who may be like 7 or 8 years old, and they can recite the whole Quran to you, word for word.
We've kept this tradition alive,
We've kept this tradition alive.
and if anyone ever wants to realize how important memorization was, I have this quote from Imam Ahmad
Hmm.
actually, which it makes complete sense.
Hmm.
So Imam Ahmad was asked if memorizing 100,000 ahadith qualified someone as a jurist. He
Hmm.
replied no.
Hmm.
The questioner then inquired about 200,000 ahadith, to which he again responded negatively. This
Hmm.
continued up until the number 500,000 brought forward, and that's when Imam Ahmad said, yes, that is when he can claim to know something. Claimed.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Because
I mean,
Imam,
we'll take that with a pinch of salt, but it's at
no, no,
least gives
no.
you a sense of it gives you a sense of what they gave importance to.
I'll actually be honest, for
Hmm.
Imam Ahmad, this was probably very, very serious
Okay.
because being a part of the Ahlul Hadith strand,
This is what they were
actually
all about.
they were all about this. And then which is why Tabari remarked, I
Hmm.
don't think of Imam Ahmad as a jurist.
Hmm.
He's a muhaddith.
Hmm.
That's why he said this.
Hmm.
So when the Musnad was being compiled, Imam Ahmad went through almost a million traditions and
Hmm.
sifted through them, the various splinter chains, which we will call turuk,
Hmm.
and arrived at 30,000, which he thought were probably all right-ish.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So um, there's obviously this emphasis on memorization.
Yeah,
And
of course, yeah.
regarding all of these people, once again, regardless of whether or not we have manuscripts that are extant, you have Imam Bukhari's and Imam Muslim's Sahihain. You have variation in their individual manuscripts. Yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
But the canonical versions of them, let's just
Hmm.
compare this. Imam Bukhari is narrating a text from the same chain as is Imam Muslim, but through different routes. One narrator at the end will be different. It is hilarious how they often have the same text.
Right.
Seldom will you actually find perhaps one extra verb or perhaps one extra adjective. Seldom.
Hmm.
You go back to an earlier book, you go back to the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, you'll find the same text there.
Hmm.
So, regardless of whether or not we wrote things down, our method worked.
Hmm.
It did work.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm not saying that our method was foolproof. It worked
Yeah.
for purposes of the Ahlul Hadith.
Hmm.
Whether their approach was correct, which I don't think it was,
Hmm.
and there were issues with the inherent epistemology of relying on this, because when you
Yeah.
drop something off its context, then you've essentially devoid it of meaning.
Yeah.
So,
But when
regard
you make something, when you make something your bread and butter, when you make something your obsession, that then you become all about it, right? Then they did
yes,
put in a lot of time and effort in trying
absolutely.
to preserve the content as much as possible, as much as humanly possible.
Humanly possible, because this was a human science. This was not
Hmm.
divinely ordained. It was not revealed by God.
Angels were not writing it. I mean, human
They were
beings were
not.
writing it. Yeah.
Human beings were writing it, and God did not ensure its protection.
Hmm.
Perhaps this is the gift this ummah can give to their prophet, that
Hmm.
we did preserve whatever we could.
Hmm.
And now you have modern methods of hadith criticism, which I think we should take with a pinch
Hmm.
of salt at least, but we should nonetheless take them. You have isnad cum matan analysis, which helps
Yeah.
us trace the historicity of the text itself, which is very
Hmm.
helpful. You
Hmm.
have different approaches. A lot of Orientalists have very valuable points to bring forward.
Hmm.
And by
Hmm.
Orientalists, I don't necessarily mean non-Muslims.
Yeah.
I any uh,
We could call that a methodology, or we could call that
yes,
an approach to critical analysis.
good analysis.
And the thing is that nobody's entirely wrong
Nobody's entirely wrong.
and
Absolutely
nobody's entirely right.
right even. Yes, there's
So
always
you'll find that there is good criticism coming from them, and then
yeah.
there's going to be bad criticism, which is polemical, which is partisan as well.
I think about
And
that
you
part.
would get the same situation on our side as well. Even there is so much sectarianism and so much
Yeah,
division within Muslims, you would see the same polemical
I mean you can see
approach
it
to each
when
other.
you can see it when, for example,
Hmm.
different sources of Shia and Sunni hadith are brought forward. You can see it within our own
Of
tradition.
course, of
But
course.
then with the Western tradition, our interaction with that was more was more toxic.
Hmm.
When you take a look at, for example, early Orientalists, that would
Yeah.
be Theodore Nudelke. You would look at Joseph Sacht,
Hmm.
um, and a few other people. Their view of Islam was inherently critical, and they were accusing the entire tradition of deceit.
Hmm.
That's really what it boils down to, that
Yeah.
this entire tradition has lied.
Hmm.
Naturally, that had a more extreme response.
Yeah.
But you will then find over the course of the 20th century, as interactions increased, as we got our own universities, as
Hmm.
they're modernized,
Hmm.
you eventually got to this middle ground
Hmm.
where you now had people like Harold Motsky,
Hmm.
more balanced. And then on our side, you had people like Jonathan Brown.
Okay.
Right? who are from both worlds. And you have a lot of figures like these who share some level of familiarity with both traditions. Yasir Qazi is
Hmm.
one for
Hmm.
theology, if not
Hmm.
hadith. So it happens.
Hmm. Hmm.
Our
And it
interaction.
also depends on, the thing is that whatever you sit down to criticize, it will have problems. But the question is how charitably you are looking at it. I mean, you could be too charitable, in which case you will not do justice to criticism. But if you are reasonably charitable, then you would not go to any extreme, right?
You
You
know,
will give them due credit, but at the same time, you will identify flaws in it.
I think this, and I suppose we can talk about Muslims here the most, since
Hmm.
I'm from that tradition, I am a Muslim.
Hmm.
So l- there is no such thing as Islamic history.
Hmm. One history.
No, there is no such thing as Islamic history. There is a thing such as Muslim history,
Right. Oh, of course, of course. I understand what
right?
you're saying.
This history that we have in the form of the books of Hadith, is it about Islam? Yes.
Hmm.
Does it deal?
Muslim histories in plural.
Yes.
Hmm.
Muslim history is included.
Hmm.
Yes. You will find that the Prophet is the most important person in Islam.
Hmm.
His personality is Islamic. It is sanctioned by God. That's what Islamic means.
Hmm.
This entire field is our interpretation of that figure.
Hmm.
And there is not one interpretation of that figure that exists. I'm sure there's one
Hmm.
correct one,
Hmm.
but you have a Shia interpretation, you have a Sunni interpretation, you have an Mabadi interpretation.
Hmm.
Within these, you have your own little schools that have their own interpretations.
Hmm.
And rather than thinking of even Sufism, let's just talk about that,
Hmm.
it's not sanctioned by God.
Hmm.
It's a science that the Muslims developed, keeping in
Hmm.
mind God.
Hmm.
Similarly, history, Muslim history, is a science that Muslims developed, keeping in mind God.
Hmm.
Sufism is inherently Islamic psychology. That's what it's
Hmm.
called. But we
Hmm.
can call it Muslim psychology. Okay. That was
Hmm.
technically influenced by Islamic ideas.
Hmm.
The same can be said about Muslim philosophy.
Hmm.
It's influenced by Islamic ideas, but there's nothing about it that makes it inherently Islamic.
Hmm.
So this entire science of Hadith, is it about God? Yes.
Hmm.
But sanctioned by God? No.
Hmm. It's Muslims doing that work.
It's Muslims doing their work. It's our civilization.
Hmm.
And just like you have other forms of history, you have this form of history. You have your
Hmm.
own form of law.
Hmm.
It may not be in vogue anymore. It may be
Hmm.
confined to history, yes,
Hmm.
but it exists.
Hmm. And there's also not one Islamic law.
There
There
is
are
one
Muslim
Muslim law.
laws in plural.
Yes,
There
you
are
have
debates between them, and then there are distinctions between them, and then major disputes there too.
everywhere. There is
Hmm.
probably beyond 26, 27 issues you will find that we don't agree on
Hmm.
any.
Hmm. And
So,
which is natural as well, because if people are doing things depending on what knowledge they had access to, what were their circumstances, and how things transpired for them, the individual circumstances would to some degree determine what paths they would follow.
yes, and
Hmm.
variation was always a part of Islamic history
Hmm.
because in our civilization,
Hmm.
we, and okay, this is Orientalist theory, but to some extent it is true.
Hmm.
At geographical schools,
That's
before you
true.
had actual formal schools with founders, you
Hmm.
had geographical schools. So the people of Medina had their own law. The
Hmm.
people of Kufa had their own law. And so much so that when Abu Ja'far al-Mansur told Imam Malik that I will make this book of yours the law of the land, he said, no. People
Hmm.
in our tradition have always had their own laws depending on where they live. Different
Hmm.
companions had different ideas. Some were sent to Kufa, some were sent to Sham, some were sent to Yemen.
Hmm.
There is variation, and that variation is permissible.
Yeah. Yeah. And basically, what we are saying is that different geography means different access to knowledge, right? You were saying that Ibn Hazm, a much later scholar, did not have access to Tirmidhi, I believe, right?
Yes.
So even a much later scholar can have access to less information than other people, and
Yep.
they could have access to fragmented information. They could have access to partial information, and at the end of the day, when time comes to making judgments, they have to make judgments, and they would have they would make their own choices as well in terms of how they go about it.
Yes, so you will find
Hmm.
in the Hanafi school, let's just talk about that. The Hanafis of Balkh,
Hmm.
the Hanafis of um, another region were completely different.
Hmm. Hmm. So
So
just circling back to hadith. So I mean that the point is that these things developed organically.
yes,
They have, challenges that any human science would have,
yes.
right? And also, different people made different choices, because of which you would see the work that they produce would have, necessary differences between them as well.
You can
And
actually
it's up to later people to then read all of it and then,
it's entirely up
make
to
their own
us.
judgments and
Actually,
hmm.
I can liken this to natural science, whereby a
Hmm.
theory that is posited in our tradition,
Hmm.
it's a working theory. It
Hmm.
stands for today. So, for
Hmm.
example, if I'm saying the first book was Zuhri's, that's true for today because we
Hmm.
don't know it.
Hmm.
Would we get categorical evidence that no, the first book was prepared by Ibn Jurayj? Fine,
Hmm.
fine. Let's
Hmm.
give ourselves the benefit of that doubt. It is 1400 years old.
Yeah.
And let's not forget, during these 1400 years, we've had invasions. The
Hmm.
Mongols sacked Baghdad. I'm sure a lot was lost there.
Hmm. Hmm.
That was, again, our major seat of learning.
Hmm.
Libraries at Alexandria were burned.
Hmm.
Scholars were killed. I'm sure
Hmm.
had everything gone perfectly, then we would have had everything, but we don't.
Yeah. Yeah. So natural processes are involved as well
Yes.
in there. And I was just going to make a point that compared to physical or natural sciences, they have this imminent possibility of something that you can test and verify now and even later. But with any kind of historical science, that possibility is really not available, right?
Uh,
Once the time has passed, maybe you could do something, but you cannot go back in time,
no, you
and
can't. You will
and
always
and you
have.
can ensure that, okay, if something wasn't written down or captured properly, let's go back in time and write it down perfectly this time, so that we know that everything that now we have is perfect. You can't do that anymore. The time has passed, things have happened, books are lost, people have forgotten stuff,
Yep.
things have mixed up. All those things you just carry on, and you try and do your best to try and sort and sift through them as humanly possible, and then you leave it to God, right?
That's what it boils down to.
Hmm.
Since our juristic schools exist,
Hmm.
and the actual way when if I was ever to carry out an academic study, if I looked at how hadith formed, I'd look at our juristic schools.
Hmm.
I would do an academic analysis of, okay, this is how the Maliki tradition accepted a hadith. This is how the
Hmm.
Hanafi tradition accepted a hadith. This would really tell me what's
Hmm.
happening. Everything so far is very abstract and historical.
Hmm.
That's the more practical aspect.
Right.
Because the Hanbali school is, well, inherently a hadith-centric school.
Hmm.
The Shafi school is inherently hadith-centric school. This entire development can, in fact, be attributed to Imam Shafi.
Hmm.
It is because of him that scholars really devoted a lot of effort to,
Developed a passion for this.
yes, when he said this is the
Hmm.
ilm of the khassa,
Hmm.
that scholars must know.
Hmm.
So it served as farz al-kifaya, someone had to know it.
Hmm. All right, cool. So I think for this session, I think we've covered enough ground. Let's make a stop here, and let's return with kind of the rest of the content that you've planned in the next section. And I thank you for your time here, Shah.
Thank you.
Uh, Let me play the conclusion here.